Welcome everybody. Let me first kick off the panel by asking PJ to start and give your impression of the talks that you've, or at least the talk that you've seen so far, and what your thoughts are, what your intuitions are, your general reactions to the idea of being morally enhanced are. PJ, go.
Unfortunately, I missed the first talk, so I apologize. And I caught most of James's talk. There's a little bit going on over here right now. Moral enhancement, I think James really nailed the delicate balance of both cultures and what is the morality we're addressing? What are the ethics? I tend to steer away from the word moral because to me it has specific cultural religious overtones as opposed to ethics, which can be released from that, but that's my personal preference. It's an incredible balancing act that we're looking at of how do we give freedom to be who you choose to be and yet have a society that reflects our best values. And we're at such an extraordinary juncture right now in the West, at least in human history, where we have a confluence of events that are forcing people to the edges of belief systems. And we've never, well, I take it back. We've had many times in our human history where this has happened. And I'm absolutely fascinated by Danaher's axial ethics because that's actually what I deal in and where my personal work comes from. So I'm very excited about this panel. Can't hear you, Adam. You're muted.
Yeah, I've come down with COVID and I'm feeling even more vague than I normally do.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Sympathies.
Yeah. It's an inopportune time, but I'm on the way up again. I've sort of been, I caught it almost 5 days ago, and the first 3 days were hell. It's better now.
Right. And it's also 4:45 in the morning for Aussies.
Yeah, that's right, in Australia. Yeah, I just had a coffee. A strange time to have a coffee for me, but I think I
should have thought of that before you decided to live over there.
Yeah, I know. Damn, I blame my parents. Jesus, what were they thinking? All right. So generally, if the majority of the population of a democratic state were morally deficient, would it be okay to morally enhance the population, or does it cross the line, i.e. by manipulating a population's will?
I'd actually like to hear Pramod opine on this a little bit, because you mentioned in your comments, Pramod, that you agreed with the intuition that education was a form of moral enhancement and always had been. And the debates over education have always had moral components as well. So the debates over whether it was going to have a deleterious effect to teach evolution, the debate now over whether teaching about the history of racism in the United States is somehow making white kids feel bad and therefore not something we should do. The idea that everybody should have an education and learn to read in the first place is controversial. And as you pointed out, I think controversial in a lot of the developing world because they don't think it's morally acceptable for women to learn to read or have any kind of education whatsoever in some societies. So you agree with this intuition that this whole debate that we've been having for 200 years about public education is a moral enhancement debate, a political moral enhancement debate.
Yes, absolutely. And the current debates about the content of that education, which you see coming up in the United States, is also reflected in not quite exactly the same, but in slightly different ways in India as well, where the revision of history, for instance, trying to change the nature and identity and character of victims and perpetrators is underway as well, with the result that apportioning moral responsibility for events in the past, apportioning responsibility among communities, castes, classes, that particular shift has occurred, as you said, in the case of the United States about teaching racism. So the contentious issue is not about education alone, but publicly funded education as to whether a state can actually or ought to promote and fund public education in which these kinds of histories are being taught, and as a consequence produce segments of students who feel morally on the losing side or on the perpetrator side in terms of a historical wrong. The second is also debates about reparation and mass guilt has also been brought to the fore, where the debate has been yet again to do with public education, because and that's what I was trying to say, that the external pressure for moral enhancement, if it's state-driven, then it will get mired in some of these debates. So when, for instance, Adam kicked off the question with the question, if a lot of the population is found to be morally deficient, would it be appropriate to engineer or insist on moral enhancement? Well, that is perhaps already underway when in the example James gave about the debate over intelligent design, teaching evolution in the Darwinian sense, and the kind of revisionism of history that is taking place. In my mind, that is akin to moral enhancement, or at least moral engineering. I'm not quite sure we can use the term enhancement to call that, to change the nature of historical events, to change the nature of the dominant historical interpretations and the nature of identities as to who did what to whom. Once you begin to change that, then you're already in the realm of moral engineering, aren't we?
Okay, so what you're saying is we already do it. Is it okay? What could go wrong? What could go right? And what if we were to do it in more of a radical way using modern technology, whether that be BCIs or biomedical means or pharmacological means or whatnot?
Cultural revolutions are already moral engineering modes in many ways, which is why the point I was making about the apportioning of moral responsibility for historical. I mean, if we were to say, for instance, for most of the global South, that we redefine what happened under colonialism. I'm going back to the example James took early in the talk, in the conversation. Would that not be also moral engineering in one sense? You know? So cultural revolutions have always already been doing that. The production of a certain kind of literature or textbooks, which textbooks are always a subject of some controversy in India, in the Indian education system, for trying to, as they call it, whitewash history. It's a standard phrase that you find in public discourses about the subject. So aren't cultural revolutions already doing that? It's perhaps a more innocuous, more insidious way of doing things rather than the drastic measure of a pharmacological intervention into how people take moral decisions and moral judgments. But yes.
But the pharmacological history is also hundreds of years old, or thousands or millions or whatever. An example being the introduction of caffeine, coffee into European culture during the Enlightenment, which the predominant intoxicant before that had been alcohol, and has the systematic effects that I was talking about. And then you had these coffee houses in England and France that were central to the spread of a certain kind of moral idea, a certain kind of cultural and political revolution, but were also enabled by the systematic moral enhancement of drinking a caffeinated beverage, which allowed you to think these new exciting thoughts. And also has been shown to have a slight openness to experience effect in terms of personality. So I think, this is a long history. The effort of alcohol prohibition in the United States, other places, was directly linked to abolitionism, women's rights. It was the drunk man spending all the family's money on alcohol and then coming home and beating the wife and kids that caused this connection between a revolution in gender relations and this notion we have to get rid of this particular drug because it has a disenhancing effect on our society. So,
but was also, sorry, if I can just interrupt 1 second. It was also it was also anti-immigrant and racist in its basis as well, because the perception was that alcohol was consumed by undesirables, usually immigrants and minorities. So this
but
is
we're also taking cocaine and marijuana and raping our women. So
right, reefer madness. So I just want to go back to the idea of this cultural engineering and this moral engineering, because we have been doing it forever in human society, and we can look at each technological paradigm shift as the time where we had to come up with the new way of looking at ourselves as individuals, in our communities, and in our societies. This is that axial concept of ethics. And if we're looking at the axial age, and I'm defining it as the first millennium BCE, it wasn't just agriculture, it was cities, it was jobs, it was all the things that came together. The Enlightenment, the printing press. Oh my God, the printing press. This is where the first mass moral direction came from, because the first things that were printed were either the Bible or pornography, which is usually how it goes with any new technology. So the questions we're asking actually aren't new at all. And this has always been my take to the transhuman experiment, is none of these questions are new. We're now applying new technologies, and we are in this paradigm shift time right now where we're going to come up with a new ethical framework. We have no choice, because, and going back to Andrew's question earlier, we must come up with an ethical framework because we're going to be dealing with social pressures and individual identity issues that we have never dealt with before. So that brings up an entirely new set of ethics. It's going to inform all of our systems from here on in. And this is the period we're actually creating them. So we've got a lot on, they're high stakes.
I agree totally with what you said, PJ. What stands out for me is the fact that, well, we can draw on history to inform our sort of decisions about what we should do with the technology that we have today, but it can't be the only thing that we use to inform our choices about the way we use our technology for the betterment of the future of humanity.
But it is the only, but there really is only one process, and that is we invent the technology first. We have this technological paradigm shift, and then we all look around at each other and say, oh my goodness, now what? Like the ways we used to answer questions and the mythologies that we built to support that new social system, they don't completely apply. We don't get rid of the Bronze Age. We just keep on stacking new mythologies on top of it that become part of our ethical framework. It's sedimentary, as is anything in human endeavor. And I think I think it's really easy to fall into the mistake that we are reinventing the wheel. It's the jetpack in theory. But instead, it's really social media. It's the noosphere. It's new ways of communicating and building communities that we've never had as humans until the last 20 years. And we are deep in a increasing polarity between the choices we can make. And it's not a, well, I think polarity is the wrong word because it's not two-dimensional. There's three-dimensional choices to make in what paradigm are we going with, and what are the ethics that refer to that paradigm.
Multipolarity.
And say again?
Well,
Multipolarity,
multipolar,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious, how do we see our new definitions of identity? Because this is what ethics is, right? What's ethics? Who are we? How do we relate to one another? What rules and laws do we create to have a positive society that moves in the direction most of us agree is the way we should go? And if we're having these top-down technologies, which have the ability to actually fundamentally change our identity, if you put a brain-computer interface in your head, how do you know who's ruling you? We already see it in social media. Persuasion is an old field, sadly one that has many people are experts in. And you don't need a brain-computer interface to persuade people. You just need decent media. You need well-produced media, and relentlessly produced, constant. These are the things we're already dealing with, and we will be dealing with more in the future. And really, all a brain-computer interface is another media that has a far more profound effect right now than television or internet. But again, the same questions, because they've changed the identity. They've already changed the identity of who we are.
BJ, you know that I agree with your perspective, and I have generally defended, for instance, social media, but just the effects of social media on society seem to give us pause, just give you pause, because I don't know if you saw the recent article by John Haidt called "The Reason the Last 10 Years Have Been Uniquely Stupid," and he pins a lot of the blame on social media as a kind of accelerant of all the bad stuff. I usually write that off as moral panic, but I don't know.
I think, well, I have my own relationship with the works of John Haidt, that he often brings up good points, but not necessarily great conclusions. If that makes any sense. The more powerful the communication technology, the more likely it can skew us to the edges of belief systems, because the siloization that's happened, and I know he discusses this, that the idea that you can find in any community in physical space, you're only going to find so many people who might think the way you do. But suddenly, if you have the world as your community, you find many more people who believe in things that may not be reality, or anyone's reality. And that ability to ignore the rest of the information space and focus in on a very tiny fraction, I agree, is a problem. My fear, and this goes back to, when I wrote about all this in Conscience, my fear with the Chinese social engineering is that that's simply going to spread, and it already is starting to spread. We're already seeing the kinds of, in social media, we're already seeing the kinds of, we have a fundamental dilemma: to censor or not to censor information. If you don't censor information, you end up with the Karl Popper, Nassim Taleb issue of tolerating the intolerant. If you do censor information, whose information gets censored? So I keep on trying to come to a middle ground. And James will know this is one of the things he always laughs at me about. Because I am trying to come to some kind of communicative moral middle when we talk about ethics, because neither extreme is ethical, because you're excluding people from the global conversation. But How we arrive at that and the amount of people we can help make aware that they actually have a choice in how they participate in the global conversation with brain-computer interfaces and social media and all the rest. That's my question, is the, how do we engage so people understand that everything they do is an ethical act? Every media choice they make, every communications choice, every participation in the noosphere is an ethical act. And we can talk about the nitty gritty of, and I can go into brain computer interfaces all day, but I'm personally trying to grapple with, if we're going to be inventing a new ethical framework, which I really truly believe we are, like your discussion with Anders about the environmental space, these are things we've never discussed ethically in history until the last 50 years. I'm trying to figure out where that goes next. How do we influence that conversation? We're a very small group here. And the academic space is a small group. How do we influence that conversation more? I think it's through storytelling, but of course I'm biased.
Martin, go for it.
I was just, if I can have a little question, do you think that, I'm following this conversation for quite a bit of time right now, and I thought that since the beginning of the pandemic, I thought that the radical steps are essential in here. So I was almost like crazy talking that we should have aging by the pandemics. We should have longevity therapies instead of vaccines.
Well, I think you're touching on something that's extremely important about COVID, which is the politicization of public health, which is not entirely novel. I mean, ever since we've had public health interventions, they've been politicized. But we killed 500,000 people unnecessarily in the United States because the Republicans decided to polemicize against masks and vaccinations. And I don't think we should have gone the Chinese route, which is demonstrably stupid and cruel. But I think that the route that we took in the United States was demonstrably stupid and cruel also, just in a way that people were doing it to themselves. But at any rate, I do think what that poses is how our concerns about emerging technologies intersect with the biopolitics of the situation that we've just come through. And biopolitics here does get more back to the Foucauldian notion of biopolitics, the notion that the state has an interest in understanding and controlling the body, and that a lot of the public health interventions that we've seen over the last couple hundred years have been a part of the growing epidemiological understanding of the state. I do think one of the things that we will see in the future is the increasing intimacy of our own personal health monitoring with these epidemiological systems. And so I've written a little bit about what it would mean to have a global immune system, so that you don't just have a Fitbit, but you have an internal immune system that is plugged into and conversant with the CDC and then with the global health system. Something gets recognized in Vietnam, a new emergent pathogen, it gets sent up to the system, monitors start going off. When you get a download, just like in your computer, the latest computer virus, you have to be protected against the latest computer virus. You get a download, your watch injects it into you, everybody's set. You no longer have to worry about that particular pathogen. Now, how we get there and how we ensure that something that invasive is still protecting our privacy, and in the context of what we've just been through, how people will probably burn down the entire world before they allow a system like that to be built. I don't know, but I think that's the kind of questions that we need to be thinking about.
Can I just comment on because originally I was going to ask if there is a way to create that kind of storytelling that would go beyond any sort of differences between different political agendas. Is there a way to actually create that kind of big picture which will be good for everyone, so everyone could have that in mind as a vision of the great future?
I don't think that there's one story everyone agrees on. You know, it just ask any author and look at their reviews, especially when they're writing speculative fiction about hot button topics. You'll get people go, oh my God, this is the vision of the future. And you'll have other people who say, this is awful. This is evil. This is, I don't agree. Wow, why did they have to make their story so political? It's only, your story is only ever political if the person reading it doesn't agree with your politics, because you're not swimming in the same water they are. I think that it's a lot to ask for all the humans to agree on anything. And I think it's impossible, in fact. We all come from different cultures. We all come from different environments, different upbringings, different family dynamics. And it takes a great deal to change, personally. We have technologies for that. They're just not brain-computer interface technologies yet. I think it's a lot to ask for a universal anything. I just don't see that in the I don't see that in the next century. Maybe sometime when we actually are all hooked up to the noosphere simultaneously and having to take all that in, that might change. But I somehow doubt it anytime in the near future.
Well, we're seeing not all that many social media platforms out there. There used to be a lot more, but there's definitely some dominant ones now. Do you think that'll happen? You think it'll get less? Facebook will have less market in the future, or yeah?
Musk is going to buy them all and figure it out for us.
That's right.
Sorry, did I laugh out loud?
Pramod, I haven't heard from you for a while. Have you got any thoughts on?
I want to get back to the point PJ made about storytelling and revolutions. And she specifically mentioned printing technologies, which were transformational in ways that was unprecedented. And the anxieties over this, it also links up with what James mentioned about coffee and coffee houses, which was an 18th century fascination for a certain class of society and a certain group of people. English culture being made in coffee houses, for instance. And Samuel Pepys, for instance, the inveterate diarist, recording only one entry on a particular day, which says, I drank tea today, because tea had just arrived. And for him, it was an iconic moment in his life. But how did tea arrive is not a point he's particularly interested in exploring, and the history of colonialism, which congeals around this beverage. But print, yes. How did print transform? And the fact that more people were reading material available cheaper, produced more libelous tracts than ever before. John Milton was at the heart of the censorship argument as well, as we know. So to censor or not to censor information, as PJ put it. The point of difference I have with what PJ said is that technological paradigms happen, and then we work our way around it. But technological shifts also happen because the cultures demand a certain technological move. So it's also that cultures produce a certain technology, not that technology produces a culture alone. It's not that way alone. So it's because it's required, because it's demanded, because it's deemed necessary. Now, what is deemed to be necessary, as we have been saying, is perhaps decided on social media rather than by the bioscientists in the laboratories working to produce a certain idea of the future, to produce a certain idea of a solution to that future. So media and storytelling do remain at the cornerstone of how any debate about the future can go. But I, like PJ, do not think that we can evolve a universal category, a universal thought, a universal idea or ideal about this. If it does, if that change has to come, it will come in very incremental, very small incremental doses at local levels, which is why debates ought to continue. But how much of the debate is allowed, we are not quite sure. Censorship occurs in the academia as well. What can be said, it cannot be said, and in what way can it be said? After Adichie and others, of course, we speak about the dangers of a single story. But in many cases, a single story is all that prevails now. In an age where hate speech outdoes anything else, how do we evolve universal thinking about what the future should be like? James spoke about the biopolitics during COVID-19, during the ongoing COVID-19, so to speak. But it's also important to note that some of that biopolitics was about the right of some people to have enhanced immunities, enhanced medical care, not a care extended as a universal right. And the discourse around that was also divided between the state and the market, wasn't it? The state determining who can be allowed to die, so to speak. States of exception being announced, categories of people in the state of exception being announced. It has a lot to do with the nature of public discourse, which has so drastically changed. Or perhaps it just crept in upon us and we didn't notice that it had changed till it was too late. But the nature of public discourse has changed considerably about the state of the future, the kind of future that would arrive at some point, or as the visions of the apocalypse that come. And we saw a lot of it during COVID-19, end times and things like that. It has to do with hidden curricula in schools, colleges. It has to do with public discourses. I'm also not sure that we have got past the debate to censor or not to censor. I think that always has remained. At any point where there has been public discourse, it has remained. There were the first major moves about libel appeared when print appeared. About scurrility becoming a watchword for people. And that applies even now. So it's not just social media, I would think, that is responsible. It's the changed nature of the public discourse, which we ought to perhaps worry about. Social media is one component of it. I think, for example, school, college curricula are also something we need to worry about.
What about the role of fact-checking? I found it quite great that there's websites out there that are trying to keep abreast of the public comments and what politicians have had to say, or public commentary and stuff. But not all of them can be correct all the time. How much should we trust these, and how do we make them better? Do you think fact-checking is amenable to the same sorts of fault-tolerant approaches as like replication testing in science or something like that? What are your thoughts on fact-checking?
Personally, I'm fascinated and quite encouraged by some of the progress in using artificial intelligence or machine learning or whatever to automate various kinds of content moderation. Let's not call it censorship, but content moderation. Recognizing hate speech, pornography, various kinds of things. We usually run up against it when it doesn't work right, when it catches something it shouldn't. But the Russians are trying to build their own RuTube now, and they don't have any of the algorithmic tools that YouTube does. And so it takes a week for anything to get posted because it has to go through human moderation before. And YouTube just automatically is checking everything with their algorithms. I think that's kind of interesting. I think it doesn't really get us away from the problem of what the standards are and who sets them. And the fact that in order to really understand, for instance, hate speech, I mean, Twitter and I guess it's Facebook's role in the Rohingya violence in Burma, put a filter on the fact that they would have had to have hired like 50 Burmese language experts just to try to keep on top of all the things that were happening there. And so I think there's some inherent limitations. I'm actually giving a talk about it this week. I'm going to present in a local high school. I'm going to present the students with various Twitter posts about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and say, is this hate speech? You know, when somebody retweets from a Russian account to a Chinese account to some American far right or far left account, that Bucha was just a staged crisis actor situation and that corpses don't actually look like that. Is that hate speech? I don't know that you could write an algorithm that would recognize that as hate speech. So I think there's an inherent problem here. But for the progress that we've made so far, I think it's pretty interesting.
You know, in terms of censorship, a lot of people don't want certain, they just want to censor each other, and people have sort of different sensitivities to what they want censored. Like, you know, I mean, when you have a look at the political debates going on, often you want to, you know, you see that the different sides, they just want to like censor each other and make it illegal for each other to say certain things. I don't know, where does censoring work? And where have you seen it spectacularly fail?
I think censorship works when it's about preventing violence, when it's also about preventing the erasure of others by the overwhelming speech of another side. I need to know that, here's the thing. No matter what we do with speech, there's going to be certain percentages of people along a spectrum of authority. For instance, 30% of any culture is authoritarian. We know this. We've counted. And the question becomes, in liberal democracies, is how much do we allow that speech to come out? You know, and if you read either Popper or Taleb, if you see cultures where the tail wagged the dog, where the small percentage of people who felt a certain way, who wanted not only their views heard, but they needed to be the dominant 30% over the rest of the 70% of culture. Those cultures became ultimately intolerant of anything else. So how do we in a liberal democracy allow them to be heard, but not take over? That the 30% doesn't subsume the 70%. I think the number that he actually gave was, I think it was like 20% of a culture can take over an entire culture. Like there's a tipping point. If they are given both the power of communication, the power of the law, and the power of authority. The example he uses is Saudi Arabia, where at the time of the religious conflicts there, the ruling class decided, well, we're going to institute this form of Islam over everybody else. And they were actually a very small percentage. The radical imams were a small percentage of the population, but it was supported by the royals, and that's what happened. So that's the point where you want censorship. You want to be able to say, if you're saying things that are going to hurt, physically hurt, psychologically, and I mean really psychologically damage. I'm not saying you feel like you're a victim. We all have our victimizations in this life. But where we really think that genocide, civil war, the big stuff, terrorism, domestic terrorism, where you are denied a job, you are denied a voice, you are denied any ability to function in this society unless you adapt. That certainly is a line. If you're calling for the death of others, that's a huge line. So I feel comfortable with that, you know, and I'm all about making sure we actually hear the other voices, because you know what, you need to know they're there. We got very complacent in the US, thinking that, oh, well, those far right people, you know, they're all a bunch of, you know, religious loons. No, they're not. Most of the people who voted, you know, in an authoritarian president were doing it to put more money in their pocket. And that's the point where we have to start thinking about, well, what does power look like in our culture? So,
in places where it becomes a grey area, it becomes impractical to censor. Then what's the next best thing? I brought up fact checkers. How do you think that do they work for you? And if they do work, that's great. But if they don't, or if they could use improvement, how could they improve in the future? What's the role of fact checking in places where I guess censorship isn't warranted?
I like the experiments with automatic links to fact checking, and I don't know what kind of algorithm they're using and how they're choosing, you know, where to send you, but I think it's an interesting experiment. I think it's inherently problematic, because the idea that you're going to be able to find an objective source for anything is problematic. So, but I like it. I mean, this is part of the external moral assistance that I imagine we will hopefully have as an adjunct to our own democratic decision making. In Alistair Reynolds' universe in science fiction, he has a society called the Demarchists, who are between the confluencers, who are the Borg, basically a nice version of the Borg, and the people who are totally against doing anything to your brain. And in between are the Demarchists, who have a chip in the back of their head that is constantly processing all the social and political decision making that's going on in their society, interfacing it with subconsciously with their own values, and then making decisions, participating in a democratic decision making process on their behalf without any of it having to be conscious. And I really love that idea, because the burden of democratic participation is so great. But I think one of the other extrapolations of that is the notion that even if we don't have a chip in our head, it would be nice to have artificial intelligence which knew us well enough to know what kinds of things we wanted to monitor, and were able to parse the relative truth claims. I can't tell you, I mean, I'm sure we've all done this, but I see something, I like the headline, I didn't read it, and I don't know anything about the truth claim of it, but I just want to reshare it because it fits with my tribal political identity, you know, and this is pretty common. We all do this, right? But I would like to have a flag, and that's part of what you're getting at, Adam, with these automatic flags that Facebook is trying to come up with. I would like to have a flag that says, you know, on the basis of your values, this guy's actually a Nazi, so you probably don't want to repost him, or whatever the complaint would be. And I think that would be morally enhancing for all of us. We would then have to make decisions about what kind of things we did, or whether we wanted to repost disinformation or not. I mean, I think you can make an argument for why it's moral to repost disinformation if you believe in the cause. So,
if I can just respond to Jean's, because I don't really know if I made any sense listening to James and typing with my fingers at the same time. Jean, the reason that it takes more information to disprove bad information is that, I'll take a look at that comic. Thanks, Jimmy. Is that we don't hear negations as humans. We take out the words that are the dominant words in a concept, and we don't hear the no or the not in it. So when you say there are no weapons, when someone says there were weapons of mass destruction, and you know they're false, so you say there were no weapons of mass destruction. All the people hear is there were weapons of mass destruction in that negated statement. So my joke is the 10 Commandments are a to-do list. In fact, you wouldn't have actually looked at your neighbor's wife until someone told you not to look at your neighbor's wife. And then you look at your neighbor's wife, and in fact, she starts to look pretty hot. So this is just how the human brain works. And I think that the back foot of negating false information, we have to learn how to be better persuaders. Don't repeat the information. Don't show the information and then say, hey, this is bullshit. Instead, pardon my language, instead, you need to come up with a positive, persuasive statement that doesn't repeat the fake information in it. That is a crucial mistake that people make. And you think you're immune to it. I trust you. In the amount of information you're taking through and processing on a daily basis, there's stuff that's going to get through and you're not.
Yeah. Well, one of the things where I think fact checking could evolve is if it, if there are a lot more resources put behind it, for instance, and it weren't necessarily tethered to individual organizations, much like, I guess the enterprise of science, where stuff gets peer reviewed and stuff gets fact checked in terms of being able to be replicated and all that sort of stuff. But it's slow. And often we need a very rapid fact checking process that can make sense and fact check politicians' statements, shortly after they make them, rather than wait months down the track for these things to be validated for a long and difficult process. So, yeah.
Can I ask Hugo to weigh in if you have any thoughts? Because Hugo, are you still living in Hong Kong, but you were living in China for quite a while, and I've said some hyperbolic things about it. I wondered if you had, and you're also a machine learning expert, so what if you had any reflections on any of this?
Well, I lived 12 years in China, but I got politically fired. I don't know if you know that. I was trying to persuade the president of the equivalent of an Ivy League university in China, to make the city we were living in like the China Center for Artificial Brain. It's an industry and research center. And then he started warming to the idea. But I said, but we'd have trouble getting Western professors in because they know about Mao. He said, what do you mean? They said, well, he killed 80 million Chinese. And the next thing, I have an email saying, my contract would not be renewed. So I have a hatred of the CCP.
One of the most.
So you got fired, but do you think that you have been very concerned in the history of your career with the future apocalyptic consequences of artificial intelligence? Does the situation made you any more pessimistic than the giga deaths that you had predicted before?
Yeah, recently Adam filled me, so I was trying to give an overview of what's been happening over the past decade or so. And I certainly noticed a huge increase in the awareness of the problem. Many people are now much more conscious that this is a real growing threat. As what I talk about, the IQ gap, like human level intelligence, machine level intelligence, and that gap is closing. But the comment I was making, that gap hasn't closed sufficiently yet for there to be huge controversy. But I do see that coming. So my general feeling hasn't really changed very much. I'm just waiting. Well, in a couple of months, I'm going to be 75. That's my definition of an old man. I think I will see a raging debate on this within my lifetime. I still suspect there'll be a major conflict over this issue as people really get their backs up both ways. The people with the big vision, there's a whole universe out there, one side, and the other side, it's too dangerous. We can't let our machines be more intelligent than we are. So I don't yet see a major change in that basic polarity, I'm still quite pessimistic, but I think I'll probably die before there's an actual major conflict. Does that sort of answer your question?
Thank you. It also reminds me, there's an hour-long interview out with Elon Musk, who I have intense feelings about, both positive and negative. But he reviews, it's with the guy who runs TED, and he reviews his various business ventures and is very explicit about, which he's been before, about why he is supporting Neuralink as a potential opportunity for us to connect artificial intelligence to the human brain and therefore stay ahead of the Terminator singularity scenarios. So I'm not sure that he's right about that, but see.
My feeling, if people cyborg, the three categories of people, if you like, entities. So the straight human beings, the modified or cyborg human beings, and the machines themselves. I think once people start cyborging, then the level of paranoia amongst the pure humans will be even greater. I mean, if you can put just a tiny chip with that nanotech into your brain, and suddenly you're like 10 times smarter, then physically you would be indistinguishable from somebody who has not been cyborg. So I see the level of the humans, their paranoia just skyrocketing. So I don't see, with this third category. Sorry, I'm getting a little tired. It is now 4:30 in the morning for Aussies. So I see the level of the pure humans, their paranoia increasing greatly once the cyborgs start existing, because they would then be indistinguishable from ordinary human beings, and who of course would be different from the machines. So the machines are sort of them out there, but the cyborgs are sort of us in a sense, but also alien. So I don't see the cyborging of humanity being a solution. To go around the problem between humans and machines. So have the humans themselves become the machines, because in the time it takes for that transition to occur, I think the human beings, the level of paranoia that they will have may generate the conflict. I don't know if that's clear.
Just to keep on that topic, Hugo, I wonder if you agree with this, that cyborgs will never be able to improve themselves as quickly as pure artificial intelligences. That we cyborgs, if we are connected with a Neuralink to AI systems, there still will be constraints in our brain, in our skull, so we won't be able to be as smart as pure silicon. So I doubt that this is a viable solution to preventing misuse of a very powerful AI. I think that we need to find other ways to control or align AI rather than hoping that humans in the loop will be able to steer things. So that's my reservation about this idea of, which both Elon Musk and Ray Kurzweil, they both say, don't worry about robots leaving us behind. We will merge with the robots. But I don't think we will be as fast improving, even if we are cyborgs, as the robots or the AIs.
Yeah, I agree with you. In fact, in some ways, I'm still a little bit cynical of the what's the word? It's where the fatigue's getting me. Transhumanist. I'm a numbers guy, background, pure math physics, computer theory, that kind of thing. So when I look at the numbers, just the sheer technological capacities, with quantum computing, nanotech, femtotech, all that sort of stuff, the numbers are just so gargantuan that once this process that you're alluding to, once it really gets going, the superiority levels of these creatures would be just so vastly above us that my scare then is that they will just ignore us, and may be utterly indifferent to us because they feel so superior to us. They may just treat us like ants. I know they may get rid of all the oxygen or something, and just we get wiped out, and they don't give a damn.
And if this does happen whilst you're still young and healthy as you are now, where will you be voting for? Will you be voting with the Terrans or the Cosmists?
Well,
or the machines.
I don't know if you can see it, but just looking at the direction of my eyes, I'm really into high definition big screens. Like I have I don't know if you're familiar with the term, a triptych. Like I have a big screen in front of me and another one on the left, another one on the right. And there's sort of like 86 inch and 75 inch and 4K and 8K and all that kind of thing. So I get mesmerized when I watch in 4K or 8K galaxies and that kind of thing in beautifully visual, what's the word? Immersive. You feel you're actually in the image, even though it's only two-dimensional. But it gives me a sense of cosmic consciousness. So I'm very, very aware of the big picture. So in my heart, in my gut, I'm what I call cosmist. I think humanity should move on to this much, much bigger picture. So that, but on the other hand, I'll go to a park and I'll see these little kids, and they may get wiped out. So I'm very ambivalent. But it's a binary decision. We do it or we don't. So ultimately, I choose to, personally, to do it. I think humanity should go cosmos. There's a whole universe out there, right?
Perhaps this is a time to bring back a concept PJ was talking about earlier. She said we're living in a multipolar world. It's not just one dimension. There are several different dimensions on which we need to make up our minds. So it's not just Terrans versus Cosmos. I mean, PJ, could you say something more about the different, that landscape? What are the decisions that we collectively need to take, not just one, but several?
We're so used to thinking in dualities that it becomes very difficult for humans, and this is both a Bronze Age and an Enlightenment problem, that it becomes very hard for humans to start thinking in these multipolar ways. So it's not just mind versus body or science versus spirituality, or, we can come up with left versus right. We can come up with all of the two-dimensional polarities, but I think there's not only gradation along the two-dimensional plane, but there's also gradation in a three-dimensional plane of both time, space, and I incorporate that into technology as well. That how we feel about all of these issues is greatly influenced by a huge variety. I actually think far more variables than I could ever come up with. But if I started making a list, I actually started making a list of all of the dualist concepts we had and how we're going to blow those apart, because that's part of what I'm writing right now. And, it just kept on going. And every single one of these dualists, let's say mind versus body, we know now from science that we're actually one giant feedback loop, right? That we have almost as many neurons within our digestive system as we have in our brains, and that we're providing a constant chemical flood back and forth between our brains and our gut. Let's just forget body, let's just say gut. That what we think of as our mind is a very large, expansive concept. And then if you want to really get into it, you can start thinking about, the collective consciousness. And I'm not talking about Jung. I'm talking about what we see every day now in a noospheric sense of it's not just my mind and a bunch of other people's minds, but that we're working in real time, simultaneously solving problems using each other's minds in that hive mind sense, which in science fiction, a century ago, the hive mind was a horrific concept. That was the other. That was the villain. That was the bad thing. And now we're starting to live in it, and we're seeing positive aspects of it. So through time and technology, we're experiencing a new sense of that multipolar experience that we once had. So we're in constant shift. It's such a big concept. I'm writing a book about it's part of this. So, but I think that we have to start I mentioned earlier this whole idea of the bottom line is we need to teach critical thinking and we need to teach systems thinking. And part of critical and systems thinking is an ability to step outside and say, okay, what are my assumptions? Are my assumptions right? What about that person's assumptions? And until we're really capable of doing that, and I think, again, with a global mind concept, we're getting closer, we're going to start having a sense of where we can be inspired by. What are the things that can influence us to make our next choice, our next ethical decision? And it may not be from the community we traditionally thought as our community. I'm just, at this point, I'm just babbling.
One thing that I'd like to add is, I'm totally on board with teaching critical thinking and systems thinking. Did a really interesting course a while ago on Coursera, which was free. I think it still is, called Learning How to Learn. Definitely recommend people picking that one up. Now, but also the world is just so darn complex. Nobody can sort of learn everything. And, part of critical thinking is learning how to prune what is useful and what isn't. But still, there's a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of useful information out there that no one person can digest at all. And it becomes even more difficult when things are obscure and difficult to understand. And so the processes whereby we sort of govern society are so complex that no one person can really understand them either. Where AI is designed in such a way that it's running on massive amounts of data and correlating a lot of data, but the models that it creates are unintelligible. We can't understand them. The deep learning ones, for example, we look at the models that it generates. It can produce, the outputs can be really interesting, like the GTP3 variants and the amazing capability of the transformer networks that are producing really cool art, but we just don't know how these models are really doing it underneath the hood to the extent that we should. It's a problem. So I'm just wondering whether we can sort of design intelligible processes. How do we make things simple enough that we can digest them and make sense of them a lot more easily, is the short question I'd ask.
Maybe the problem is unsolvable in the sense that you need those neural complexities to perform at levels beyond human. I've always had that suspicion. Like, one of the reasons I got bored with the research that I was doing, it's one of the early guys evolving neural network dynamics to control robots and all this stuff. And after a while, I just got bored because they were essentially black boxes, these neural networks that I was evolving. I didn't understand how they worked. They worked well. It was great engineering, evolutionary engineering. But as science, they after 20 years of that, I just got fed up with it. Then once I retired, I just switched over to pure math. So maybe it's, the complexity levels are just unavoidable and unsolvable, question mark.
I don't know, I think it's just the paradigm we have with AI at the moment. We haven't worked out how to do causal learning at scale yet. Sure, we have Bayesian networks, but we need to elicit expertise and have somebody programming it. Manually. Look, I don't know what the state of the art is with what Tom Everett and his team are doing at DeepMind, but he's going to be speaking about that tomorrow. It'd be very interesting. I think it could be a moral enhancer if we could have an AI that would be able to provide guidance through complex moral issues while able to provide a true explanation for its guidance. For now, sure, we could have a deep learning system that could sprout or generate a believable explanation that isn't true, because AI at the moment is very good at generating believable text or very interesting text. Yeah. PJ, have you had any experience with mucking around with one of these transformer networks or language text generation algorithms to create boilerplate text for, I don't know, ideas on writing stuff? I know people are doing that.
I have not.
Yeah.
I have not. I let my subconscious be my guide.
Yeah, that's cool. But I mean, it's happening now, and I mean, I can imagine it'll get even more interesting as news outlets have access to these algorithms, or maybe they already do, where they start generating articles at breakneck speed.
I recently, for JEET, by the way, if any of you are academic writers, please consider submitting to the journal that the IEET runs called the Journal of Evolution Ethics and Emerging Technologies. It used to be called the Journal of Evolution Technology. And I just published an essay there on intelligent tutoring systems, which I thought was an interesting challenge, because most people consider teaching to be something that can't possibly be automated. And I was like, well, let's take a look at that. But one of the things that I ran across as I was doing that article is all the intelligent writing assistance programs that are out there. And I think I first experimented with this 20 years ago when I bought a program that you could put a lot of details about a work of fiction you wanted to write and say, these are the relationships, and it would generate it would be generative for your writing. But there's a lot of progress in the automatic writing stuff that I think people should be aware of.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, and it's the sort of tool that could be sort of used for good or bad, right? It could be used for all sorts of propaganda and, fake news generation. So many bots on Twitter so many of the Twitter accounts are bots, and they're generating automatic text in one way or another. So we're already subject to computational propaganda from that source. Adam, just as a final thought, I thought I might share a disturbing experience I just had, which is, has anyone heard of Alexander Dugin, a theorist of far-right fascism in Russia? I think I've heard of him.
Down. Definitely down. However, he turns out to be really smart. He's written 30 books. He's a Heidegger scholar. And when I finally saw this hour and a half presentation of his ideas, one of the central things that he talks about is he sees the entire pre-modern world as being in a fight against liberal individualism and the Enlightenment and neoliberal capitalism as a part of that. And that the whole Russian, or Eurasian, as he would call it, project which includes India as far as he's concerned, is to have a resistance on the part of people who see the self embedded in religion, culture, and pre-modern identity against this West, which is trying to strip everyone down to individualist monads that have all these deficits. The problem, I think, is that he's right, that there is a big problem with the nakedness of the liberal individual in the modern world. And we've begun to see in the United States life expectancy going down for a lot of people, partly because of deaths of despair. There's a kind of Durkheimian explanation here that people are no longer embedded in culture of meaning. And this is where I see the connection between, and you brought this up, Pramod, and then PJ is interested in the storytelling aspect of this. And I think this is the connection, that what we're critically missing is the story of what it means to move beyond liberal Enlightenment individualism to a new form of connectedness, a new vision. Like my favorite Bible passage is, without a vision, the people perish. We need a new vision beyond the pre-modern ones, beyond race and tribe and nation, and one that is a truly cosmic vision, as Hugo was saying, one that takes us to the stars. And it has to be a liberal one, but it also has to be a vision. It can't just be do whatever you want and that's fine. It has to be a vision of a liberal utopia in the stars. And this is why I'm a Trekkie, but you know, I hope you succeed, PJ, but I agree. That is the project that we're all in, is trying to create that vision.
I'm working on it. And the word you all need to learn is not utopia, it's heterotopia. Go back to your Foucault, and James gets it, because it's heterotopias are the place where change happens. Utopia is no place for a reason. Dystopia, obviously, we're trying to avoid. Heterotopias are the place where a group of people within some kind of boundaries creates change, and that's really where we're going to find it.
Well, they're not just places of change, they're places of inversion. And inversion becomes the way to change. So I agree totally with what PJ was saying, that, and if you think in terms of processes that enable that heterotopias to emerge, then that is what must be taught, read, written, published. Subject to normal, of course, normalized conditions of censorship, acceptability, and all of that. I mean, those are more or less a given, I guess. Now, PJ would be able to better tell us about that. But yes, excuse me. But the point is that it must be kept up. That kind of discourse must be kept up. And without that, it's just a giving in. So heterotopias don't appear, they must be made to appear. I guess that's what PJ was getting at, that the more stories you tell, the more public discourse that operates in certain ways and for certain ends in mind, so to speak, the heterotopias must be made to appear. And it's not a question of what kind of place that is that we are heading towards, but when also. At what point does it arrive? We have been speaking about tipping points all through the evening, early morning. Okay, different time zones. I'm a bit confused as to who's where at which point in time. But that apart, we've been speaking about tipping points all through. And the critic Kermode will speak about not end time, of being in the end time. That it's not imminent, but imminent. It's built into what happens on a daily basis. We continue to be in end time. But that apart, what Kermode says in The Sense of an Ending is that it's a point of honor to postpone it by even one day. And that would be heterotopic in my view. To have that being a part of the debate, being a part of the debate ourselves is crucial. And I think PG was pointing towards something like that, the heterotopia to come, I guess, would be how I would see it.
David Wood posted in the chat that there's a, or it has already run, okay, a Future of Life Institute has run a contest asking entrants to create positive, credible visions for the world for the medium-term future. Yeah, I think that's a great thing, because I'm concerned that a lot of people are just too dark about the future, that they've got nothing to hope for and just want to see everything burn down. I think we do need to inspire people to sort of work towards better futures. I don't want people to feel so depressed that they don't want to, then unable to enact towards a better world. Yeah.
It was a well-run contest. They asked people to submit 4 pieces of work. One, they should submit a timeline with 2 events every year between 2022 and 2045, and also a data point for every year. So that was the world building aspect, how things would take place over time. But the ground rules were that it had to end up in a world which artificial general intelligence had existed for 5 years and was safe, and there had been no major wars. There may have been some skirmishes and battles, but the world had not gone badly wrong. So how could this happen? That was the question that people were asked to answer in these timelines. Also, 2 day in the life stories of up to 1,000 words each on people from different parts of the world living in 2045. What would it be like in concrete terms? And then there was a media piece that people were asked to create. And finally, there were 13 essay questions with 750 words each. How did this happen? How did that happen? What was a major piece of technology? What was a social institute? And so I was watching this community. There was a discourse for nearly 2 months, many people getting involved. And from what I can see, there's been lots of really good entries submitted with all kinds of people. So that's an encouraging sign. I don't know yet what's going to be in the top 20 entries. That's going to be announced in the 15th of May, I believe. So it's still 3 weeks away. I think the judges are going to have a hard job filtering through more than 200 entries to pick the top 20. But this is a positive initiative. And so I think at least some of the stories that come out of that are things probably we want to build on in the future.
Yes, Pramod and PJ and James, thank you so much for being part of this panel, and for the audience for asking great questions and everything. I really appreciate all your participation.